Hello, lovely people. This is Spirit House here. I am reading from The Secret of Light by Walter Russell. It is chapter 16 today, and it is The Senses Deceive. I'm just looking for that. Okay. Imagine a perfectly motionless wheel and a fly walking around its rim, moving ever forward over changing ground, and the wheel seemingly moving backward during a continuity of time in which the fly sensed a constant change in the changeless wheel. Every time the fly got back to the same point, it would compute the past time consumed on the journey and the forward time necessary for the next circuit. The wheel being still, motion, change, and time are created by the fly itself, as it takes the whole idea of the wheel apart by journeying around it and examining it bit by bit. The fly sensed motion by changing its position on the wheel. It sensed change by finding a seeming difference of condition at each forward movement. It sensed time by creating the sequences necessary and taking the one idea of the wheel apart and dividing it into many separate ideas. This simple analogy is a good symbol of creation. The planet, like the fly on the wheel, moves forever around its motionless orbit. The orbit is as rigid and still as the wheel upon which the fly is moving. As the planet moves upon the wheel of its orbit, it senses constant motion and change. It senses changes of days into nights, of spirit merging into summer, autumn into winter. All of these seeming changes are in the motion of the planet and not in the wheel of its orbit. Each change is entirely due to the motion of the planet and not to the changeless orbit. The planet itself registers change on its changeless wheel. Change, therefore, lies in motion alone. The senses are motion, therefore the senses sense only that which they themselves are. Inadequacy of the senses. Man overrates his senses. He places too much dependence upon them without justification, for they are not recording of all the phenomena of his surroundings. He likewise trusts them too much without justification, for they are constantly deceiving him. While his senses are recording the stillness and rest of nature on a lazy afternoon, they are failing to record the violent motion of everything in his entire environment, from the blade of grass to the clouds and heavens above him. Those seemingly motionless clouds are moving at the speed of 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, without the slightest evidence of that swift motion being recorded upon his senses. The earth also is moving many miles per second in two directions, one of rotation upon its axis and the other of revolution around its orbit. Its concentric, this is my own note. Its concentric rings of motion, which the planet moves according to its axis and the geomagnetic conditions from the sun alone. Okay, that's my own note. The deception is as it should be, just as the same deception in a cinema is as it should be. God's universe is but an electric recording of his knowing, manifested by his thinking. To thus record the idea of his knowing in the two lights of his thinking, a three-dimensional universe is necessary. If the senses could detect record all motion instead of but a part of it, the illusion would disappear. The senses would see behind the illusion and find that all motion voids itself. Division of the whole into parts causes the illusion. If the film were removed from the projector, of the motion picture, the illusion of motion and change would be voided. That is what creation is, the one light of knowing divided into the patterned parts of thinking. Sensing is but an electric tension set up by the seeming division of one into many which strain, quote unquote, to fill their desire for oneness. When a university of condition is consummated, sensation between those parts ceases because the tension ceases. The senses, being but tension of desire for unity between divided parts, have no existence. The senses are electric flux threads of light, connecting every particle in the universe with every other particle. They are the intercommunicating nerves of the one universal body. When strains of desire for balance, rest, or unity ceases, sensation ceases. In this electric universe, sensation is the strain of resistance to the separation which exists between all separated masses. All matter is one. Separated particles desire to find that oneness. It is part of God's plan that the senses are limited entirely to the recording of a very small fraction of effect. The senses can never sense the whole, but the conscious mind can know the whole. And captions from the Divine Iliad. These words I now say for newly comprehending man of his new cycle. Love ye one another. Love thee one another, all men, for ye are all one me. Whosoever you do to one, in me you do to all, for all are one in me. Love thy brother as thyself. Serve thy brother before thyself. Lift high thy brother. Lift them to high pinnacles, for thy brother is thyself. For a verity I say, love of self, or nation of self, turneth neighbor against neighbor, and nation against nation. Self-love breeds hate and soweth its seed in all the winds to blow wherever it will. Wherefore I say, love of thy neighbor for neighbor, and nation for nation, uniteth all men as one. Serve first thy brother, hurt first thyself rather than thy neighbor. Gain not from him unbalanced by thy giving. Protect thou the weak with thy strength. For if thou use thy strength against him, as his weakness will prevail against thee, and thy strength will avail thee not. He who giveth love prospereth mightily, but he who taketh aught gaineth not. Wherefore lose all to gain the world, gaining naught? He who hath not laid upon a treasure in heaven to equal treasure gained of earth has sought the dark. For him the light is far. From the Divine Iliad. Chapter 17, Man's New Cycle. This coming age will mark an epochal advancement in man's evolution towards his goal of omniscience and omnipotence. Man becomes a higher being with great power as he acquires knowledge. In knowledge alone lies power. Only through knowledge can man become co-creator with God. Knowledge can be obtained by man only through awareness of the spirit within him. Lack of that awareness is the tragedy of today's civilization. During the last century of the greatest scientific progresses in history of man, great nations of the world have killed, robbed, and enslaved other men to build their own empires. Even today, man kills by the millions, condoning his killing as necessary for his self-preservation. He is now but reaping the seed of his sowing. He who lives by the sword shall die by the sword. No man can hurt another man without condemning himself to greater hurt. Fear dominates the world today. While fear is in the world, love cannot also be. Love can never dominate the world until man ceases to live a primarily sensed existence and knows the light of the spirit within him. This new age brings man one step nearer to the universe of greater knowing, through greater comprehension of man's relation to man and to God. Each past cycle in the growth of man toward higher levels has been illumined by the few inspired messengers of the light who have known God in themselves. New inspired messengers who know God in themselves will likewise give the light to this new cycle, and these few messengers of the light must multiply into legions, for the need of a spiritual awakening is great. We are in peril. That's my own footnote. Man's whole reason for being is to gradually pass through his millions of years of physical sensing into his ultimate goal of spiritual knowing. Man has now reached a transition point in his unfolding where he must have that knowing. He can acquire that knowing only through greater awareness of the light of the universal self, which centers him as one with God.